All right, week 6 of our study in the Gospel of Mark. And the shadow of the cross grows more distinct. We are halfway through chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark. We left off with his teaching on what actually is clean versus unclean. If you've looked through the Old Testament, even just a skimming of it, you will get the sense that they had very distinct rules as to what was ceremonially clean and unclean. And Jesus, he tells them that the thing that actually makes you unclean, right, is what comes from within you. The overflow of your heart. And after this conversation, he goes away. There is some speculation, because Mark doesn't explain why. He decides then to leave his usual region of work and head off to what is known as the region of Tyre and Sidon. It was used to be, from what I've read, the territory that belonged to the tribe of Asher, but under the Roman Empire, it had become a primarily Hellenistic Gentile, so basically Greek-speaking Gentile area. And it says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. And what follows is an incident that troubles people greatly. A woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Why would he say such a thing? I think it helps to look at the situation from this woman's side. Here she is, approaching a famous Jewish teacher, a rabbi. And who is she? Well, for one thing, she's a Gentile. She's not even a Jewish woman. She's not even a Samaritan woman, which would be kind of like, it has its own issues, and we've seen that in John's gospel. But she is completely disconnected from the worship of God. We've seen, again, in other gospels where a Gentile was actually brought, it was recommended to Jesus because he was a God-fearer, had helped build their synagogue and helped the community greatly. But this woman has no such recommendation to come with her, and she's a woman. In that culture, she should have sent her husband. And the fact that she came herself would have suggested to a Jewish mindset that she might be a woman of some uncertain moral character. And yet, even with all this stacked against her, she falls down at his feet and begs him to set her daughter free. What do you suppose she expected him to say? Well, at the very worst, he wouldn't have paid any attention to her at all. He would have just had someone remove her so that he he would not become unclean himself by participating in her removal, should we say. And yet, he speaks to her. And what he says, to our mind, sounds absolutely horrible. And many have stumbled over this because it sounds so bigoted. But you have to remember, this is what she would have expected, even as a positive response. But for two things. When he says, let the children be fed, he said first. Implies a second, right? That once the children have been fed, then even the dogs would be taken care of. You have to remember, Jewish culture did not keep dogs as pets as a general rule. They were unclean animals. And if you've kept a dog and you've taken a dog outside at any point, you know exactly why. They roll in anything. They delight in filth. The stinkier, the better. And so a culture that's based on ceremonial cleanness would never keep a dog unless it was to, guard a flock out in the fields and never, ever to come into the house. So when he's talking about let the children be fed first, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He's talking about throwing it outside to these scavenging animals. But he also uses the diminutive in Greek, like little dogs. It's not a really strong argument for sort of an affectionate term, but there's two things there, right? First, let the children be fed first. And, little dogs, not, just this immediate recoil. And what does he mean by this? Because she even understands this. The children. Who are the children? The children are the people of Israel. He is sent to the people of Israel. That's his ministry. There is even a point, if you look at some of the other Gospels, where Gentiles come and ask to see him, and he doesn't go to them, but he marks that as a transition. That the gospel has come to the point of reaching out beyond the people of Israel. Mark is bringing us to that point now, because there's a small detail here in her response to him. First off, her response shows two things: humility, that she acknowledges he is Jewish, and so his concern is for the Jewish people. But there is also faith. That even while the children are eating, even the dogs, the outsiders, they can pick up whatever is dropped. That's the humility, but it's also the faith that he will not turn her away. And there's an interesting point here that I had never noticed, but was pointed out in the commentary. This woman, this Gentile, Syrophoenician by birth woman, is the only person in the Gospel of Mark to address Jesus as Lord, Kyrios. And in the midst of all these other things, where he is talking to great crowds, he's talking to the Jewish leaders, he's talking to his disciples. And Mark is showing them basically all as spiritually deaf and blind. This woman is the only one who seems to perceive clearly who Jesus is. She calls him Lord. And for her faith, her child is freed immediately, as is Mark's favorite word. Now, this begins a period of ministry that takes place in largely Gentile populated areas, because he goes from the region of Tyre and Sidon over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee again, back to the Decapolis, noted for its demon-possessed man on the shore and its sudden lack of live pigs. But if you remember, at the end of that visit, he was asked to leave. They were so disturbed by what had happened that they just didn't want him there anymore. But look at this. He comes back to the Decapolis, and it says they. I always hate it when things start with they, but it is some unidentified group of people bring him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment and begged him to lay his hands on him. Now, here we have a second situation in a Gentile area where someone comes to Jesus and pleads with him for some sort of healing. And what follows is a very detailed account of a healing, and people are prone to overanalyze this. Well, why did he do it this way? Why did he do it that way? What did this mean? Did that? And, there are a lot of theories that arise from this, but what we have here is Jesus takes the man aside from the crowd privately, puts his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touches the man's tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. I think rather than get stuck trying to overinterpret the details of the healing, you have to remember that Jesus is doing what no one can do. But you also have to remember he is fulfilling the promises from the Old Testament prophets. If you think in particular about Isaiah chapter 35, say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With the recompense of God, he will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes, and a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to all those who walk on the way. He is coming to restore what sin has destroyed. And the response, when he charges them to tell no one, it says, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it, because they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. And there's an echo there, all the way back to Exodus, really. When Moses protests against being God's messenger, what is his excuse? I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. And the Lord says, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? And here we have, he even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. We have identity pointers here. Who is this man really? And why can't they see it? Because again, we hit chapter 8 and says, in those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to him, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. It doesn't say where they are, but context suggests that he is still in Gentile areas, which means this would be a largely Gentile crowd with him. And some people point to that phrase, some of them have come from far away, as evidence of that, because quite often that's how they refer to those who are far off, those who are not Jewish. But here, are we seeing a hint, a foreshadowing of the Gentiles being included at the Messianic banquet? Could be. But the main concern here is that they've stayed with him all this time, listening to him. They've used up whatever supplies they had, and they're a fair way off from the nearest place to get more. And his disciples ask, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And I don't know about you, but I sit here thinking, wait a second, shouldn't you be having a very strong sense of deja vu here? It's not like this has never happened before. Especially when he asks them, how many loaves do you have? Well, this time they've got 7. And the echo, the deja vu should be getting stronger, because he directs the crowd to sit down on the ground around. He takes the loaves, gives thanks, breaks them, and gives them to his disciples to set before the people. You would think, you're like, oh, right, this is how this works. And having blessed even the few small fish that they have, he says these also should be set before them. And everyone ate and was satisfied. And the disciples take up the broken pieces left over again. Last time, right? 12 baskets full. This time, 7 baskets full. And this is about 4,000 people. And again, they aren't seeing it. We'll know this for a fact later on. But after this great event, he gets in the boat and he starts heading back across the sea. And it's very abrupt. Mark is usually very abrupt, but it's like when he lands in the midst of a group of Pharisees who are there to argue with him. And they seek from him a sign from heaven to test him. Naturally, one might wonder, why aren't the miracles themselves enough of a sign? Well, they're looking for an unmistakable sign of God's approval, of authentication. And previously, they had attributed some of his signs to Satan. So they are demanding something unmistakably from God. Except, again, going back to Exodus, if you recall, the signs that Moses did were by and large duplicated by Pharaoh's magicians. Authenticating signs can be duplicated, can be falsified. And the miracles themselves should be enough for anyone with a genuine wish to know if Jesus was from God. So it's no surprise that when they want to test him by asking him for a sign from heaven, Jesus sighs deeply inwardly and says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." There's a couple things about that. You remember healing of the deaf man, he looks up to heaven and sighs. And here he sighs deeply in his spirit. There's it's kind of the same root word gives rise to both of these terms. As we see in Romans 8, where Paul talks about the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. It's that same deep inward sigh. So the question is, are these moments of intense prayer before he responds, before he heals? And the other thing about this, in English, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's been translated, "Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." But in the original, it's more like, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if ever a sign is given to this generation." There's an absolute determination. No sign. No, absolutely not. And why do you think that is? They're testing God. Now, it is true that on rare occasions, God has actually required people to test him, to prove him faithful. This is not one of those times. This is one of those times where they take it upon themselves to demand that the second person of the Trinity prove himself, with no intention of believing him one way or another. This is what he faces. So he gets into the boat again and goes back over. Right now is not the time to butt heads with these people. He is approaching. You have to remember, we're at the midway point in the Gospel of Mark, and most of the second half of the Gospel of Mark is given over to his last week in Jerusalem. He is fast approaching his ultimate purpose for coming. And so he has to spend extra time. He is trying to pull away to teach his closest disciples, his apostles who will be sent. And there's a lot he needs to teach them. When they're in the boat and they're headed across, it says they had forgotten to bring bread and they'd only one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautions them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Might suppose this is that determination to refuse to believe the gospel, that demanding of a sign. Well, on Herod's point, it was more of he wanted the entertainment value of it. The Pharisees, it was more prove yourself. But the same rejection, the same refusal is behind both. And as he is warning them against this refusal to accept the gospel of the kingdom, they start arguing about the fact that they had forgotten to bring supplies. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" It's curious how we began this section with the one person who seems to truly understand him being this outsider Gentile woman. And then we have the healing of a man who is deaf. And we're coming up now to the healing in Bethsaida of a man who is blind. Again, some people brought to him, this time a blind man, and begged Jesus to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" We don't see this in any of his other healings in Mark, that he asks, "Do you see anything?" But think about the theme of this whole section. Having eyes, they do not see. Having ears, they do not hear. So here he has someone who can't see, and previously someone who can't hear. And this time when he asks, "Can you see anything?" the man opens his eyes and says, I see men that they look like trees walking. It's as if the healing has partially succeeded, but partially failed. Jesus lays his hands on the man's eyes again. And when he opens his eyes this time, his sight is restored and he saw everything clearly. Sometimes a miracle is just a miracle, but sometimes it's also a lesson. That sometimes we can see in part, but we need Jesus' continual help then to see clearly. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence that then, after this incident, we have to, it's like some people have referred to it as Peter's high point and his low point as a disciple in the teachings part. Obviously, his real low point would be the denial, but it's like he has this sort of ricochet from doing really well to, well, we'll read it. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked him, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your minds on the things of God, but on the things of man. So we go from one moment when it seems like they really see Jesus for who he is. You are the Christ. But when he starts teaching them what that really means, suddenly we have "Get behind me, Satan." If you remember, when he was ready to begin his ministry, he spent the time in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. And Mark doesn't go into the details, but we know from the other Gospels that they are, all of them, prove yourself or save the world the easy way. And so when Peter is saying, you must not suffer, you must not be rejected, you must not be killed, it's basically the same thing. They have in mind a certain picture of what the Christ is, and they're rejecting what he teaches them the Christ truly is. The thing is, we can see from our own perspective that Peter really meant well. He wanted to protect Jesus. He did not want him to suffer. He wanted him to rule. But that was not the path that the Christ was to take. It was not the things of God. It was the things of man. And this leads to a very public lesson. And a lot of times you can see this as, well, what does it mean to be a disciple? But you have to also keep in mind the context. Because the disciple follows where the master goes. And if this is a description of the true disciple, it tells us something about who the Christ, the master, really is. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. You see, the thing is, a life fixated on one's own matters is incompatible with the life granted in the kingdom of God. If you are always seeking to defend what you have here and now, that is all you will ever have here and now. But if you defend what is for eternity, that will be your inheritance. Peter and his disciples had in mind the here and now. That the Christ was to be here and now conqueror. But what Jesus was teaching them is that he came to bring eternity. But to do that, he had to give up the here and now, to suffer, be rejected, be killed, and then to rise. There will be a moment, we'll come to this next week, where 3 of them at least will have a glimpse. They'll see, just for a moment, the Son of Man in all his glory and power. And this will become a moment that stays with them for their entire lives. But think about it this way. The section we've looked at today, we are among the Gentiles largely. And Jesus is showing exactly who he is, who the Messiah is. And the question we ask ourselves then, looking at this, is, do we really see it? Or can we only see what everyone sees? The here and now. And if so, it's time to ask him to open our eyes, that we might see him in truth, to open our ears that we might hear his Spirit teach and guide, rebuke when needed, to make us not only perceiving, understanding, but to make us like him also,